So the first question is, can you tell us about your work, your background, and how did you get involved with Otro, Lado?
Sure. After law school, I did the most responsible thing that I could, and I took the rest of my student loan money and went to Argentina to live for a year. I'm Puerto Rican, but I did not grow up speaking Spanish in my home, and I knew that I wanted to work with Spanish-speaking populations, and so it was important for me to study. I also knew that I was going to pick a career that would be ultimately soul-crushing, and law school crushes your soul enough, and I know I needed that time of year to get myself back and get a new skill set. So when I returned from Argentina, I applied for jobs, and I took a job with the Federal Public Defender's Office in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm originally from New Jersey. I went to college at Bryn Mawr. I went to law school at Temple, so I'm a Northeast kid at heart. And the South seemed really fascinating to me. And Alabama sentences more people to death per capita than any other state in the country, despite it being a Christian state that respects the right to life, at least on the front end. And I thought to myself, if there's ever a place where people need a good defense and someone to stand with the most unpopular person in the room, it's Alabama. And I stayed there for 6 years, and I did not only death penalty litigation, but I also represented people who were charged with federal crimes. And a lot of people think about defendants as, oh, good, criminals. But I like to think that no one can be defined by their worst mistake in their life, and that every person is redeemable. And in my time in Alabama passed one of the most repressive anti-immigrant pieces of legislation in the country at that time, which was HB 56. And when it passed that law, it criminalized so many kinds of interactions which are completely normal and that we have every day with undocumented immigrants, making it a crime to take an undocumented person to church or to the hospital or to give them a ride to work. And once we saw that law pass, we saw a dramatic increase in immigrants being charged with illegally re-entering the country, which is a federal crime to re-enter the country after someone has been deported. And when I looked at my clients that have been charged with illegal re-entry, all of whom were from Mexico or Central America, I found that they fit into two groups. One were Americanized deportees who had spent almost their entire lives in the United States, at just a few years or maybe just even a few months in their home countries, often did not speak Spanish fluently or at all. And for them, they kept crossing the border because they were trying to come home. This is where their families were, this is where their schools were, their jobs were, and they didn't know how to live in their culture. The other group were refugees, asylum seekers, who didn't understand how to ask for asylum or had tried to access the protection process and been completely ignored and shut out of the process. And so they kept crossing the border because they couldn't stay home, because staying home meant a death sentence. After 6 years in Alabama, I moved to Tijuana, Mexico. You can see this all very linear career path that I'm choosing. And I did what any responsible person would do, and I liquidated my retirement savings and decided I was gonna figure it out on the other side of the border, because it was clear to me that people did not have accurate information about the U.S. legal process and what their options were. So I began volunteering in a Catholic migrant shelter called Casa Migrante, which is part of the Scalabrini order, and they have shelters throughout Guatemala and Mexico on both the southern and the northern border. And I began talking to folks, mostly starting with deportees, about what their legal options would be to return to the United States legally to rejoin their families, or what the consequences would be if they re-entered illegally. Because what I found is some people just kept trying to come home, and they kept getting longer and longer sentences. And so they were not getting home to be with their families, they were coming home to be in prison, and they needed to know what they were facing. And then asylum seekers heard that there was this U.S. attorney lady in the house and that she would talk to you for free. And so I was at this time just using the borrowed office of the shelter's priest, and people would just line up, and I would be in the office for 10, 12 hours at a time. And eventually, I started getting the question from asylum seekers, will you come with me to the line? And that's what they call the port of entry, or the gate to the U.S. Down on the border. They call it the line. And I'll tell you about my first client that asked me this question, Jose. He traveled from El Salvador with his 3 young children, fleeing gang violence. And the gang said, you know, pay us this amount of money or we will kill your children. And they meant it because they knew where they went to school. They knew where Jose lived. They had already tried to kill his teenage son on 3 occasions, forcing him to go to the hospital. And Jose, as a single parent, he didn't want to take those risks. Those were his babies. And so he traveled all the way from El Salvador to the northern border. And I thought to myself, well, Jose, this is kind of a silly question. The law is really straightforward. You just walk up to the gate and you tell the U.S. immigration officer, Customs and Border Protection Officer, i.e. CBP, that you're there to seek asylum and they're supposed to take you in for processing and give you an interview with an asylum officer. And he said, no. You don't know what you're talking about. And I said, okay, well, maybe he just needs some support and he wants to have a person of privilege like an attorney walk with him so he feels really strong in what he's about to do. And so the week before I went, I decided to do a little recon mission through the port of entry because I knew what the law said on the books, but I didn't really know what the process looked like in practice. And so I walked through the port of entry and I'm in the building waiting to get to the ticket counter where they look at your passport. And I can see to the left of me that there's a group of people. They're all not related. It's a large group. They've got all of their belongings. They look incredibly tired and they're just sitting on the floor and they're not advancing any further in the line. And so I went up to them and I asked them, I said, what are you doing here? What is this line for? And they said, we are asylum seekers and we're waiting for the Americans to process us. And that taught me, I may not know the ins and outs of the process, but there is a process. It does exist. So the next week I went back with Jose and his 3 children, and I went up to the officer at the gate, and I said, this gentleman and his children, they are asylum seekers, and they're here to be processed. And the CBP officer looked at me and sized me up, and he said, asylum seekers, like he had never heard those words before. And he said, well, you're supposed to go to the embassy in their home country. And I said, no. He's like, well, no, you need to go to the consulate here in Tijuana. And I said, wrong again. And he's like, well, what are you? And I said, well, I'm an attorney, sir. And he said, well, are you a Mexican attorney? And I said, no, I'm a U.S. attorney, and here is my card. And I know that there is a line on the inside of this building to the left behind you where the asylum seekers are supposed to line up and wait to be processed. And just like that, magically, he could tell that I knew a little bit about what I was talking about. And of course, being a trial attorney and practicing in federal court, I had learned to fake my way through a couple of things. And so I looked like I really knew what I was talking about. And he just let us go through. And that was a light bulb moment for me because here I was, an attorney, an officer of the court, a person of power and privilege being lied to by a U.S. federal officer. And so I couldn't imagine if I was that person being lied to and being told to go away, what the experience was like for asylum seekers who did not have any of the privilege or the power that my law degree and my citizenship carry. And from there, it began. And my cell phone became a very scary place because other people started hearing there's this American U.S. Attorney, this lady, she will take you to the port of entry and she will do so for free. And so I started getting calls from other refugees, from other shelters that were housing refugees, of people that were getting turned away from the border and needed help to access the process. They didn't want to enter the U.S. illegally. They wanted to do things the correct way. And most of all, they wanted to keep themselves and their families safe. And from there, I started to document all the people that had been turned away and all the times that I had taken folks to the port of entry and CBP officers tried to turn them away, writing down the dates, writing down the times, writing down the officer's name. I call it my naughty list. No one's getting a Christmas present. Then I discovered the amazing power of the Facebook live feed, and I started to shame officers publicly by name and disseminate those videos and send them out to media, and then started to do audio recordings and send them out to media so that people could really understand what was happening to asylum seekers at the southern border. And that those videos started to catch on. And if you ever see some of them, you can slowly see my mental health decline as the problem got bigger and bigger, and I felt like no one was listening. And I was just frustrated because I was one woman in a city of thousands and thousands of refugees, and I felt like I was shouting into an abyss. During this time, I met my wonderful, beloved sisters and co-directors of the organization. We are 3 female co-directors of Otro, Lado, and we have a lot of different programming outside of the Border Rights Project. And their names are Erica Pinheiro and Nora Phillips. Nora had her own private law firm at the time, and Erica was a supervising attorney for a nonprofit called Caravans in Los Angeles that works with Central American and Mexican migrants in the city of Los Angeles. And we had all of this data of all of this government misconduct, and we thought to ourselves, what are we going to do with this? The problem is not getting better, it's getting worse, especially after the election of President Trump. It got exponentially worse. And we decided to do what any normal people would do, or they decided to do what any normal people would do. So they quit their jobs. And I continued to live on my savings. They quit their jobs, and I lived on my savings, and we decided we're going to sue the U.S. government. That's what we're going to do, and with no money. And we had a treasure trove of data, and that was enough. And we had a lot of asylum seekers that had been closed out of the process and put into harm's way because our government was refusing to follow the law. And so we shopped our data around, and was eventually picked up. The case was picked up by 3 nonprofit organizations and a law firm, and those organizations are the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C., and the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has several offices in the southern United States, and the law firm of Mayor Brown in Los Angeles. And in July of 2017, we filed our first class action lawsuit against the government with no real funding, and that's Otro, Lado v. Nielsen, and that challenges U.S. Customs and Border Protection's turning asylum seekers away from the port of entry, and this wait list that the U.S. government and the Mexican government operate in conjunction with each other, which requires asylum seekers to put their name on a wait list in order to seek protection in the United States. And this causes asylum seekers to wait in border cities from anywhere from 4 weeks to 2 months or sometimes longer, because the way the wait list functions is you put your name on the list in the morning, you get a little piece of paper with your number, but you have to keep checking when your number is going to be called. And if you miss the day that your number is called, you have to start the process all over again. Now, Tijuana is a very big city, and shelters are very spread out, and asylum seekers don't have a lot of money. And so to get to the port of entry to hear when the numbers are being called, sometimes it can take 2 hours by bus. And so you can see how easy it is to miss the day that your number is called and to have to start the process all over again. Since that time, we have filed 2 other class action lawsuits, one challenging President Trump's new rule that we were able to stop in its tracks that prevents asylum seekers that enter the border irregularly or illegally, as they like to say, outside of a port of entry from being eligible for asylum. And we said, no, 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 you cannot do that. You cannot prevent people from accessing the process the legal way, as you would say, and then when those people are desperate and in danger and pushed out to the margins, tell them they're not eligible for the relief that they seek because they didn't do things the legal way. And our most recent lawsuit, Innovation Law Lab v. Nielsen, is we've joined with other organizations to challenge President Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, which is forcing asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their cases are being heard in United States courts. Mexico is not a safe place for many migrants. Organized crime understands that migrants are vulnerable. Migrants are in transit. They're not with their families and they're in their communities, and they're very easy to disappear. They're very easy to sell. They're very easy to force into all kinds of work situations, including sex trafficking, and no one will be the wiser. And so our position is it is not safe for Mexico, for asylum seekers to remain in Mexico. Many may choose to stay in Mexico and get jobs, but those that want to proceed to seek asylum in the U.S. should not have obstacles placed in their ways to prevent them from doing so. We have other programming in Los Angeles. We represent asylum seekers who are detained in U.S. detention centers in Southern California. And then we also represent the Central American parents that were deported from the border last summer and, without their children, and their children remained behind in the U.S. We are the only legal service provider for these parents. We have spent the past 9 months going back and forth to Central America, literally trying to locate these parents because the government did not keep records of whose children and where these parents were going. And so our staff, along with human rights defenders in Central America, have gone through the hillsides and the farmlands to try and find all of these parents, and we still haven't found all of them. And 2 weeks ago, we brought 29 of those parents back up to the northern border. We got them humanitarian visas to transit through Mexico legally and safely, and we did what any normal organization would do. We bought 55 plane tickets for these 29 parents and their children from the southern border to the northern border of Mexico, and then we prepped them to turn themselves in, and we got all of their files ready, and we got churches and American families to say that they would be willing to sponsor these families if they were allowed to come into the United States to reunite with the children that the U.S. government stole from them. And we did not notify CBP that we were coming. We showed up at the port of entry with these families, and we said, you took their kids. These are asylum seekers. They want access to the process, and they want their kids back, and you're going to let them in. And CBP said, well, there's no room at the inn. Sorry, we don't have any capacity. Even though CBP is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States with the largest budget, they said they didn't have capacity to process these 29 parents whose children that they stole. And we said, we'll wait. We'll wait till you have capacity. Call other ports of entry. Figure out who has room to accept these parents. We've got vans, and we'll drive them anywhere along the southern border that you have room. But we're here because they're here to seek asylum, and we want their kids back. And eventually, after 11 or 12 hours, CBP relented. They succumbed to the pressure that different legislators in Congress had been placing on them, different celebrities that stepped in and were having a tweet storm about were tweeting at DHS and Secretary Nielsen, and eventually they had no other choice. The public opinion was on our side, and they were forced to let the parents in. 17 of those parents are still detained in ICE custody. Some of them are in solitary confinement. They have been abused horribly during their processing, with agents telling them that they are liars, that they won't get their kids back, telling them, I don't know why you're crying, we didn't invite you here. But we continue to campaign for them, and our work is not done until every single one of those parents that had their children stolen from them is reunited with those children.
Can you tell us more about this zero tolerance policy? And how were you prepared for that as an organization of Otro, Lado, or were you expecting this kind of reaction from the Trump administration?
Zero tolerance policy. The nonprofit industrial complex is a really funny place. We were a tiny organization in 2017 when we first started seeing separation of families along the border in May of that year. And we were shouting to the rafters, they are separating families, they are stealing babies. We have to do something. But we were before the caravans, but we were too small for people to really hear us. And then in May of 2018, when the policy was unveiled by the administration, we knew that it was coming, but we were not prepared for the separations to occur on that large of a scale. And it was an interesting time for us as an organization because my co-director, Erica Pinheiro, just had given birth a month earlier to her first child. So she had zero maternity leave. And as we're receiving the caravans and we're dealing with separated parents, there's Erica with her infant son on her hip because she was also breastfeeding at the time. And we were not prepared, and we were scared, but we knew that we had to do everything that we could, including not sleeping in the refugee encampment with the caravans, because we had to find these parents and we had to warn those that were going in that this was going to happen.
So the relationship between asylum seeking and well-founded fears based on religion, social group,
political opinion.
So most of the cases that you're dealing with in Otro, Lado for this asylum seeking process are related to violence, or
They're
you say
To the caravan cases, or
Yeah.
so with regard to the caravan cases, there's a mix. We see people who are fleeing political persecution because they have stood up to the government that's in power, particularly cases coming out of Honduras, which had an election in November 2017 that was widely contested, and people took to the streets to protest the results. And those protesters, some of them who are our clients, who we've won asylum for, were shot in the streets, were killed in restaurants, and no one was, or in other public places, and no one was being held accountable. We also have seen a lot of LGBTQ asylum seekers coming up through the caravans and forming their own caravans, because Latin America is simply not a safe place for you to be if you belong to any kind of sexual orientation minority or gender minority. And then we see women fleeing widespread domestic violence. In Latin America, there is an endemic violence against women, and it is very hard, even if you go to the police, to get any kind of help, because women are often treated as lesser citizens. And I've gone with women to the police station and the Human Rights Commission, and I've seen how they are treated, or how their reports they refuse to take their reports. And so women themselves can count as a social group. And then we see people fleeing gang violence. And you know, a lot of people in the U.S. sometimes think, well, there's gang violence in New York, or there's gang violence in L.A. What are we going to do? Flee to Canada? The difference is the gangs and the cartels in Mexico. They act as shadow governments. They contribute to political candidates. They pay off police, and some of them even work covertly for the police. They buy military-grade weapons from the military through bribes and intimidation. They are just as powerful, if not more powerful, than the government. So if you place a police report against a gang member in Central America or against a cartel member in Mexico, it's very, very likely that they are going to know that you placed that report against them and put their ability to make money or their freedom in danger, and then they will not only kill you, but they will kill your entire family or anyone around you. Let's say in your church, if you're attending church when they come for you, in your workplace if you're working when they come for you. And so those gang violence claims can be framed in a lot of different ways. And I'll give you an example. I represent a pastor who is an evangelical Christian pastor, and his church was on a disputed territory of the gangs MS-13 and 18th Street. And him being a pastor and having his calling, would do funeral services for whichever side needed him to do a funeral service. And one gang said to him, "You cannot do funeral services for the opposition anymore, and if you do, we will kill you and we will kill your family." And he said, "I am a man of God. I cannot do what you are asking me to do." And as a result, his church was shot up. He faced death threats. He had to place his family in hiding, and he had to come to the border to seek asylum. That is actually a religious persecution case, because it's preventing him from practicing his faith in the way that his faith calls him to practice. So gang violence cases can be framed in a lot of different ways that people don't understand do actually fit in the rubric of U.S. asylum law.
So, and what would be, how would you say that you will be representing a client and not representing other clients? What kind of information for you it's important to say, well, with this kind of information, we can make this happen?
Sure. Our model in Tijuana is legal orientation, so providing them an overview of the process that they're facing and know your rights training, so they can understand what their rights are in the system and how U.S. officials are likely going to try and violate those rights and what their strategies are for defending themselves. And our priority for representation are those who we know are going to remain detained for long term or indefinitely, and focusing on those who are vulnerable populations. LGBTQ asylum seekers who don't have any family in the U.S. or any friends that could maybe help them cobble the funds together to get an attorney, and those who we know have cases that fit under U.S. asylum law. So we have limited resources, so we have to put our resources in the cases that we know we can get some traction with.
Can you give us some examples of these Know Your Rights training?
Sure.
What kind of activities do you do with with the people you're representing, or?
A lot of times, CBP officers, when clients get into CBP custody at the border, they will be presented with documents that are in the English language, which many of them can't read. Although we do have English-speaking asylum seekers and asylum seekers that speak a lot of different languages that come to the border, and I can explain a little bit about that in a moment. But we always tell them, if something is not in your language and you can't read it, don't sign it. Because very frequently they will slip in a piece of paper and say, here, sign here, and folks will be asked to sign their own removal order, and they won't even know that they've signed for their own deportation until they're getting ready to be put on the plane. And by then, it's too late. Often they will get into custody and the official will say, you don't have the right to seek asylum, you don't have the right to an interview. And so we have to train them to withstand interrogation, withstand abuse, and to keep repeating, I want to speak with an asylum officer, I want to speak with an asylum officer, and to keep insisting no matter what kinds of threats come their way. Because what they're trying to do, these officers, is break their spirits and break their resolve and make them think that they don't have any rights in order for them to sign that piece of paper for their own removal, and then they don't have to deal with them anymore. For family separation, we prepare parents for the possibility that they may be separated from their families, and we prepare family unity documents where we have parents sign affidavits, who is their children, and we include their birth certificates and all other documentation to show this family relationship, and then we hold on to those documents. And when families that we think are at high risk of separation go into custody, we send those declarations and those documents to CBP via email. Every time they see my email on the screen, they're like, oh God. And I said, this is a family. They do not consent to being separated. If there's any reason why you think they need to be, I'm representing them and you should email me. And so those are just some of the examples of how we strategize to help people protect themselves and to protect them as well.
What are like the biggest difference that you see from the Obama administration and the Trump administration regarding the process of seeking asylum? What's like the most big changes that you could see?
Well, first I want to say that people, obviously things are terrible. They're abysmal under Trump, and he is attempting to obliterate the right to seek asylum. But things were no picnic under President Obama, and there's a reason why in the immigrant activist community we refer to him as the deporter-in-chief, and that is because he deported more immigrants under his presidency than any other president in U.S. history. The analogy that I put together for folks is President Obama had all the pieces to a gun and put them very close to each other so that they could be assembled. And now President Trump has quickly assembled that and is just shooting indiscriminately and at the immigrant community. Under President Obama, we saw the rise in family detention, and what that is exactly what it sounds like, detaining entire families, including toddlers and babies with their parents, sometimes for indefinitely, although there's been legal developments that limit that time that families can be incarcerated in jail-like settings. Under President Trump, we have seen almost a complete closing of the border. And so shortly after he was elected, I was getting calls from asylum seekers that were telling me, you know, the officer said that I needed to come back on January 20th, and then they would let me know about my asylum. And they didn't understand that January 20th was Inauguration Day, and they were just highly confused. Or CBP officers telling them, there's no more asylum for Mexico, no more Mexican asylum seekers, as if it was a TV program that had been canceled. And then for some folks, they were told, well, we're only accepting Christians from Muslim majority countries, and you just don't qualify. So the excuses became, they were different, and they show the racial animus that is being perpetuated throughout our society, and this anti-immigrant sentiment, seeing all immigrants as terrorists or wanting to bring crime to our country and take all the DACA and all the welfare and all the student loans. I'm joking. When you do this work, you have to have a sense of humor or you will spend all day crying. And so what we see is now this complete just openness about racism and xenophobia that maybe was a little bit more under wraps under the Obama administration, and this absolute intent on destroying due process rights and access to the legal process for asylum seekers.
Can you tell us more about the caravans? I guess you have been speaking with many people who were coming in different groups from the caravan, how they were displacing from their original countries through Mexico. What was the reaction of the Mexican people in the south, in Mexico City, in the north of Mexico? Can you tell us more details about this journey?
Absolutely. A lot of people don't realize that the caravans have been coming to the northern border at least to Tijuana from May of 2017, but the numbers were not as high as we've seen over the last year. And al otro lado, because we're in Tijuana, we have been there to receive the caravans and provide legal orientation because not everyone has an asylum case. Some people are fleeing circumstances that, while terrible and regrettable, do not qualify them for U.S. asylum law. And it's our job to let people know so that they don't needlessly subject themselves to the U.S. detention system and potentially get deported back to the home country that they've spent money and thousands of miles to get away from. And the rise in the caravans that we've seen over the last year largely has to do with the political instability that we're seeing in Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. That political instability is very much a product of U.S. foreign intervention and U.S. foreign policy. I obviously, as I mentioned, lived in Montgomery, Alabama for 6 years. We bordered Georgia, and in Columbus, Georgia, there's an Army base called Fort Benning, and at that Army base is the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas has gone on to train some of the worst human rights violators in Latin American history, including those who were responsible for the dirty war in Argentina, where over 30,000 people were disappeared and or killed, the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who just recently became a saint, the 36-year civil war in Guatemala. And so we have, through our own training of dictators and human rights violators, destabilized an entire region. And another thing people don't always realize is the gangs that Trump is tweeting so much about were actually homegrown in Los Angeles, California. That's where 18th Street and MS-13 were born. And then in the 90s, we began deporting them when we decided we did not want to deal with them. And we deported gang members en masse to countries that we had already destabilized and were ill-equipped to receive them. And so they have risen up to power to form a shadow government. And so this confluence of factors, in addition to the machismo that is entrenched in Latin American society that views women as lesser, in addition to the homophobia and the transphobia that views LGBTQ people as subhuman, those are some of the root causes that are causing people to flee. And many of my clients will tell me, they'll say, I didn't want to leave Honduras. Like, I lived in a beautiful place. I had my family. I had a house. My kids were in school. I had a business. The food was delicious. I don't want to go to your frozen food culture that hates immigrants. And it's cold in Minnesota, where my cousin lives. But I have to. I don't have any other options. No one wants to leave their homeland, and they do so when there are no other safe options.
I want to ask you, do they tell you if you were working with many people who were coming from the caravans, what was their experience with people in Mexico? Did they were supportive, solidarity? We have the example in Tijuana that there were groups that were organized as hate groups, and they were not responding nicely to the arrival of the caravans. Can you tell us what was the experience of the people, how they perceived the Mexicans as hostiles, as welcoming, as solidary, as racist? I don't know. How would you describe that?
What's really interesting about the reception in Mexico, as the caravans got closer to the northern border, the reception got chillier and chillier to downright hostile, and then in some cases violent. So in southern Mexico, which is not the wealthiest part of Mexico, people were willing to share everything that they had, and went out to the streets with whatever food that they had in their homes, in order to feed the people that were in transit. And as folks got closer and closer to Tijuana, we saw a rise in nationalist groups and hate groups in Tijuana, which borders San Diego, California. And to me, that's really interesting because Tijuana and San Diego have these very interdependent economies, and it's a cross-border region. You know, people have family on both sides, people go to school on both sides, people work on both sides, and it's the busiest border crossing in the hemisphere, with around 70,000 people crossing daily. And Mexicans will often say, you know, we're treated so terribly by U.S. Customs and Border Protection when we cross. We feel lesser, we feel like dirt. And they were replicating that treatment to Central American migrants. It was almost as if, oh, we found someone who, you know, who has less power than us, and so we're going to project that downward, including, unfortunately, our mayor of Tijuana, who now thankfully is under a restraining order and cannot engage in the hate speech he was engaging in, was you know, calling for the ejection of these folks from the city. And because of the rise of some of these hate groups, some of you may remember this iconic photo of a mother with two children trying to escape the tear gas that was being thrown over the border at them. That woman, Maria, and her children were under immediate risk from hate groups in Tijuana because they thought she was a bad mother, and they thought that her children should be taken away from her. And so we had to place Maria in hiding because we were so concerned that someone was either going to steal her children from her outright or was going to harm her in order to get her children. And that was largely the result of Mexican nationalists, Mexican hate groups that were perpetuating this, she's a bad mother, her kids should be taken away from her.
Something that I'm still trying to understand is that in Mexico, we have more than 130 people who work as journalists that have been murdered. We have also human rights activists who have been persecuted and have received death threats. And now it seems that lawyers like you are in a situation of extreme vulnerability. How this happened?
That's a really good question. I'm unclear. You know, I think because lawyers now are in this position where we are human rights defenders, we are challenging the actions of both the U.S. government and the Mexico government, which is collaborating with the U.S. government because it has a financial incentive to do so. Mexico receives billions of dollars from the United States under Plan Frontera Sur and other financial aid packages in order to prevent migrants from making it to the northern border. And as a result of this, myself and my two co-directors, we've been photographed by Mexican immigration and agents in civilian clothes who refuse to identify what agency that they work for. We have been harassed by CBP. I had what's called a global entry card, which allows me to pass through U.S. Customs at airports and land crossings very quickly because I have met the standards to show that I am low risk to the United States. And I had a security clearance to be a federal public defender. And now that has been revoked. Now, all of a sudden, I am a risk to my country's national security. And that is because I am shining a light on what is happening. My co-directors and I are suing the government, and we're winning. We're surviving motions to dismiss. We're surviving battles of discovery to get documents. And they know that we're getting closer to the truth. And I know I won't get the exact phrasing right, but there's this quote in Don Quixote that says, "Si los perros están ladrando, es porque estamos avanzando." See, if the dogs are barking, it's because we're getting closer. And so all of this harassment is because we are getting closer, and this is the equivalent of the dogs barking. In addition, organized crime is not too pleased because we're helping people escape. But also, more importantly, we're cutting into their profits because we're telling people about their rights. And you don't have to pay a smuggler to get across to the U.S. to seek asylum. You can present yourself to U.S. authorities at the port of entry, and we will help you to access this process. And so their profits are going down. And my response to them, which I will say in public, which a lot of people are like, I can't believe you say that in public, but whatever, is, you know what? Find a better market. Don't profit off human suffering. You know, stick to your drugs, stick to your guns, but let people who are trying to flee pass through because humans are not commodities to be sold and bought.
Something I was also kind of shocked or very shocked is that you have received the death threats that you have mentioned from criminal organization groups, from the U.S. government, from Mexican authorities of immigration. but also you have received a lot of criticism from the side of the academia by making claims that El Otro Lado and other organizations like Pueblos Sin Fronteras, or even human rights activists who have been working for many years in the defense of human rights and the defense of migrants, have been profiting from the suffering. How can you understand this critique from the academic part of the U.S. academia, who's doing this kind of attacks against you as a human rights defender, as a lawyer, and who's kind of questioning your integrity as a lawyer?
I would love to know where the profits are, because my 21-year-old card does not know. And you know, I don't understand where the critiques come from, because we do get funding for our work, but there is no job that anyone does where they are not paid for their work. You need money to buy food, and you need money to rent an apartment. And all the funding that we receive goes directly back into our work, and we keep developing new programming and filing more lawsuits as we see different cracks in the system as our clients proceed through the system. So I have invited those academics to please have conversations with our accountants. Please come to the border and see the office that I operate, which, you know, I'm very impressed by all the fancy chairs that I've been seeing on this trip. None of them are ripped, and they don't appear to have gone through a war. You know, because we're not making a lot of money, and the money that we do make goes directly into services, or, for example, getting safe houses when we find asylum seekers that can't stay in a shelter because their persecutor has chased them all through Central America and Mexico to find them at the border. So, you know, my response to them is, please come down to the border, come see what we do, come and interview me. We work with lots of different researchers the world over, and as well as media. And we invite them all to come in and look at our programming and see for themselves. And we're certainly not encouraging people to migrate. We do a lot of collaboration with shelters in southern Mexico, and we're starting to extend to programs in Central America to let people know what the reality is of the U.S. immigration system. And our presentations is not only geared to what is the law on the books, but what is the reality. We are not making it seem like this is an American dream, because often for immigrants, it is truly a nightmare. And we encourage folks, if there is an option to stay in Mexico, and if they feel even remotely safe, let's get you to a program that maybe can help you apply for some kind of humanitarian relief in Mexico, so that you don't get separated from your family, so that you don't spend years in a cell in immigration detention and get deported back to your home country because you couldn't afford to pay for an attorney to represent you, and you had to represent yourself against a prosecutor for the U.S. government in a language that is not your own.
Well, I think it's like a very good time. If somebody would like to ask a question, feel free to throw any kind of question to Nicole. And well, you have Laura. Laura,
Okay. So I'm curious, if you manage to win this suit that you are trying to win against the government, will anything change? Will you like advance one step closer to some type of policy that will open new doors, or at least don't close that many?
Absolutely. If we are able to get a restraining order, for example, to our lawsuit on the Remain in Mexico, then the U.S. government, for at least as long as we're arguing it up through the appellate courts and the Supreme Court, will have to stop returning people to Mexico. We won a restraining order in our East Bay Sanctuary Covenant case, where the U.S. government had to stop preventing asylum seekers that entered through irregular means outside of the border from being ineligible for asylum. And if we win our litigation in Otro, Lado v. Nielsen, what we will do is it will force the government to follow its own federal law.
Because they're able to set the precedent.
Exactly, and they will know that if they continue to do it, then that there will be sanctions, there will be maybe a monitor appointed, and there will be more eyes on them, and they won't be able to get away with what they're getting away with.
What is a a circumstance when someone would not be provided asylum? Like, do you get people coming to you saying that they want to come to the U.S. and you have to turn them away, or you have to try to help them find something else because it wouldn't follow the path?
Sure, absolutely. People who some refer to as economic migrants who cannot find work in their country, or the work that they find is not enough in order to feed themselves or their families. That is not a basis by one would qualify for asylum. It's unfortunate because sometimes or oftentimes the economic conditions that they're facing in Latin America is very much tied to U.S. foreign policy, but asylum law in the U.S. doesn't recognize that as a basis, and so those folks, we, say, don't go that way. There's nothing good for you to go that way, and let's figure out some other options for perhaps for you to stay in Mexico where the wage could be a little bit higher than Central America.
How much of your success do you attribute to like the legal ways in which you approach this versus like the noise that you create? For example, like we're referring to like Twitter and like they have to let you in because of that amount of noise from the public.
I would say it's 50-50 because our class action lawsuits are informed by meticulous data collection. And so we have years of data, of trends, of witnesses that have given declarations which enable us to go into court and to do so on a very strong footing because we've gathered so much evidence. And so that's the legal work, that's the investigative work that we're doing. But the public shaming that comes with media campaigns, both traditional media and social media, is very powerful because it forces those in Congress to recognize the problem, and that is we have these established federal laws and we have these international accords that we have agreed to and which our federal law enforcement, which has taken an oath to uphold the law, is violating on a routine basis. Yes, I think it's extremely helpful. We have a Twitter, Facebook, and an Instagram account, so I encourage you to go on all of them and to amplify the pieces that speak to you. Hopefully they all speak to you, and they speak to you very often, because that is how we get our message out, and that's also how we attract new volunteers to come to Tijuana or to support the project remotely. And we need more volunteers all the time because, as my co-directors would definitely, if they were here, would say, we cannot do it alone. We are exhausted, and so we rely on the work of our volunteers who are not only just attorneys, but they're volunteers from all different walks of life that speak all different languages, because Otro Lado has, since the Border Rights Project has started, has served asylum seekers from 41 different countries, speaking 13 different languages, including English, because so many folks come to the Tijuana border to seek asylum, because it's one of the safest border cities.
And what happens when a person fits into the asylum-seeking category but doesn't have the evidence to demonstrate that they're being victims of, for example, gang violence?
Well, we help, and we're also working on projects with different universities to develop country conditions evidence packets, because you can win an asylum claim by your testimony alone, but you need to submit some evidence. And maybe that evidence is a police report, but maybe you were too afraid to file that police report in Honduras because to do so is a death sentence. And so we help folks to gather that evidence through reports that are produced by the UNHCR, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other news sources that show the pattern and practice, and to show how one person's story fits within that framework. And then additionally, we also help people who are waiting to gather their own evidence. And what that means is to gather declarations from people in their home countries, or those maybe who have traveled with them, about their case and what they know. And those are handwritten letters, and we ask them, if they're too afraid to send it to you from an internet cafe in Central America, have them send it through WhatsApp as a photo, or Messenger as a photo with a copy of a photo of their national identification card. And then we help them to get that translated. So that way they're going in with some evidence, and not just only their words.
sea pass.
Mhm.
You know, they've been down there for 15 years. And so, again, she was just explaining some of the horrible circumstances. And we also met with a lot of communities there that, again, were torn between these paramilitary groups and other kinds of, regular, gang members and whatnot. And so we're looking for asylum and different things. But she told us one thing that I hadn't heard up here, and I don't know if you or other people, but I think the way these caravans are presented to us is like, oh my gosh, these 50,000 people in these caravans, and it's like, this invasion force. So they explained that the reason people go in the caravans is because this whole journey is so dangerous that this gives them a little bit of hope that, they're not going to be kidnapped or raped or whatever because, comfort in numbers. And the other thing that they told us that surprised me was that for a lot of young men, making the crossing across the border is like a rite of passage, kind of like this mythological quest, and they want to come back. And if they don't do this, there's a little bit of prejudice, in their villages against them. So that was, again, another motivator that I had never heard of, but I thought was problematic. Because, and the more danger that they can come back and talk about, the kind of more heroic their venture seems.
The first comment about traveling in caravans, that is why people travel in caravans, and that is what I've heard from all the folks that have traveled in the caravan, is that there are safety in numbers. They can secure themselves against raids by Mexican immigration or being kidnapped by organized crime along the journey. But the rite of passage comment is interesting to me, and I've not heard it framed in that way. What I have seen is young men, particularly from Guatemala and southern Mexico, that come from very rural areas, areas where they're not necessarily able to make a living that's going to support themselves and their families. And someone must migrate, and it's most often a man, in order to make money to send it back home so that they can build a house or send family members back to school, or if someone's had an operation and then they've had to go into debt and they need to pay that debt back. And so it's this cycle of migration where they need to go to the US to make the money to get the things that they need in order to have a more sustainable existence in their homes where they're coming from. Mm-hmm.
I was also just in El Paso, Texas over spring break with a group, learning all about these issues. And one thing that we found, we were with Annunciation House.
I love Annunciation House and Taylor. Did you? Yes, oh, I love them.
But one thing that we found with a lot of the migrants is that when they came out of the initial holding centers, they weren't given any of their money or their phones. Like the government had kept them, and we didn't know. I kind of left the week realizing I had not found any insight into that problem of why it was happening, or can you provide any insight of what's going on there with why people aren't given their money or their phone back after they get out of these holding centers?
They should be legally given those items back, and the reason why they're not given them back is pure human cruelty. There's no other way around it, and dropping them off in places without money or any ability to call them is to make it as difficult as possible for them to not only survive in the U.S., but to be able to show up at that next check-in with ICE, or to show up at that court hearing by taking all the resources that they came in with and stripping them of them. And so, unfortunately, the only answer to that is pure human cruelty.
Nicole, I want to ask, I think in the law school you have had more discussions on situations connected with the kids that have been separated. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about the conditions of this icebox? And I guess that's called where they live. What are happening with these kids? Like, how old are these kids? How are they divided? Do you have like some information about these specific conditions of the kids in the icebox?
Sure. When people enter the hieleras, i.e. the ice boxes, they are kept in what are essentially cages. They call them holding cells, but it's chain link fencing, and they're cages, and the lights are kept on 24 hours a day, so it's impossible to know what time it is. The temperatures are kept at freezing cold temperatures. They say it's to kill germs, but it's colder than most hospitals that anyone's ever been in, and they do that to break people's spirit. They do that to make it so painfully uncomfortable that people will give up. And they separate children from their parents very frequently because they know the children will cry and the parents can't stand to hear their children crying and suffering. People will stay in the ice boxes anywhere from a few days. We've had people in the ice boxes for as long as 2 weeks, including very young children, including infants that are going in that are just a few weeks old.
Just like one thing, I guess like how are these either certain officers, like how are they kind of getting away with it? It's either a very easy question to answer or a very difficult one. Like obviously a lot of people in the public might know the full extent of what's actually going on, but is there maybe someone above them and they're letting things slide, or it's in their best interest for these kind of awful things to happen? So I mean, yeah.
There is a culture of training out of the agency which teaches them to look at refugees as enemy combatants, as everyone is a potential terrorist, everyone is a potential gang member, everyone is a potential cartel member who is coming to the United States to do harm. And these people are not even human. So when they're looking at them, they're not seeing human beings. I'll give you an example. I was speaking with a woman who was returned to Mexico under the Return to Mexico policy. And ironically, CBP alternately tells asylum seekers that at Otro Lado, we're all fake attorneys and we're frauds. But now under Remain in Mexico, they're telling them to go to our office. So that's just a funny aside. So she showed up at our office and she was recounting her experience. And she was telling me, you know, my son, he's very affectionate. He's always hugging people. He's always happy to meet new people. And he went up to this officer and tried to hug him, and this officer just kind of pushed him off of him and said, "Don't touch me." And her son just started to cry because he had never had another human being treat him in that way. And it hurt her incredibly as a mother to see someone treating her child that way and to be able to not do anything about it because she recognized she was in a situation that was very dangerous and which she had no power. And so they are trained to look at migrants as less than human and as people who are going to do harm to the United States. And it's not unlike the training that we saw the SS guards receive during the Holocaust, where they were trained to look at Jews and other people that were killed in the Holocaust as subhuman. And so when I accuse the Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen of being guilty of being an architect of genocide, which I'm sure thrills her so much, I'm not being facetious, because those officers are trained to look at people as less than human, and they're not. They are human.
This might be naive, but do you have like any allies within the CBP? Or are there any people that's like, you know, that like, oh, that one's like a nicer person, or is it kind of across the board that's just the culture of the...
I think that my face is on a dartboard in probably the break room. When I show up at the port of entry, which I don't do anymore now, I send our volunteer attorneys and law students and folks to accompany refugees to the port of entry, because when I show up, it's kind of like the devil just walked into the room and they can smell the sulfur. They're like, it's her. And that's not because I'm not a nice person. Hopefully you all think I'm a lovely person. It's because I'm very firm and I won't back down, and I'm not going away until people act as they are supposed to act, which is in accordance with the law. There are some of them who are nicer to me than others, but generally as a whole, at Otro Lado, myself and my co-directors are widely hated by the agency.
Are you the only ones? There's no other agent, no other association that...
Yes, we are the only ones.
How can we help? I think this is the question that you may hear everywhere you go. What is like the best way that students who may come from very different fields and that may not be, for example, lawyers, like for example, students who are doing their majors in Latin American studies or in Spanish, what kind of help they could provide you if you would pretty much think about the kind of profile of the people who are helping and are volunteering with Otro.
Absolutely. We have volunteers from all different walks of life. Not everyone that comes to volunteer with us is an attorney. Not everyone that comes to volunteer with us is a Spanish speaker, because as I mentioned, we are seeing migrants from all parts of the world. And so everyone with as long as you have an ability to communicate, including if that ability is in sign language, we can use you. One of your students actually is with us for the past 3 months, Malia, and she has been one of our on-the-ground leads in data collection. And like I said, our impact litigation is so driven by data, and so she is just the queen of the data. And we all hail Malia. And she has been amazing, and she's not a lawyer. We have a volunteer medical clinic on the second floor of our building, because people can't pay attention to their legal problems if they are bleeding or about to have a baby. So if you have any sort of medical background, even if you are just a student, or someone who does, we welcome those as well. We've had people who are teachers come down because some of the people who are forced to remain in Mexico, or some of our unaccompanied minors who are children traveling without their parents, want to learn English, so that way they can advocate for themselves better before officials, because they know the words. We've had some people who are retirees who don't know Spanish and necessarily don't know how to use a computer, don't know how to teach English, but they love kids. And we have a little child care center, because parents can't pay attention to their legal cases if they have their kids stressing out and running amok. And it's also a space where kids can be kids, and they haven't had the opportunity to be just kids for a really long time. So we've had people who have come to Tijuana and found themselves for a week running the daycare center. And then we serve a meal every day, because you can't pay attention to your legal problem if you're hungry. And people are often coming to our clinic not having eaten in a few days. And sometimes, people who are like, oh, I don't really like kids. I can't speak Spanish. I'm not an attorney. I don't have any of these other skills. I'm like, do you know how to make a peanut butter sandwich? We also have this saying at our office is, we are all the toilet people. Mexico doesn't have the best plumbing, and so we're all like unplugging the toilet or fixing plumbing or sweeping or filing, including myself. And there's literally something for everyone to do. And the only things that we ask volunteers to come with is flexibility, because you may be doing something that you completely didn't imagine doing, like going to the hospital with a very pregnant Haitian woman and making sure that they attend to her so she doesn't have her baby on the street. Or you may be doing something less glamoring, like trying to find families in the ICE online locator to see if they've been separated. But every part of the job is really important. So we ask you to bring your flexibility, and most of all, your compassion and your heart.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, Nicole, thank you very much.